Good morning, everybody. Today is Remembrance Sunday, the Sunday after the 11th of November, where on this day, 104 years ago in 1918, there was an armistice signed to end the First World War. And we remember all of the people who sacrificed their lives, who gave their lives, and they fought for freedom. They thought they were fighting for freedom honorably for their nations in the First World War and also the Second World War as well. And over 1 million British citizens, subjects as they were then, died in those two wars, not just people from the UK itself, but people from Canada, Australia, India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and so on. They all contributed in the Second World War to overthrowing National Socialism, and therefore we can be free from that evil at least. Bolshevik communism, unfortunately, was even worse than National Socialism, and that went on for another 40 years until the end of the Cold War. Of course, that happened too. They were dreadful, dreadful things, of course, these two world wars that racked the world, especially Europe. Started in Europe and then went around the world, and the flower of youth of many, many countries was snuffed out. And that was a terrible, terrible thing. The best of men on both sides, whether you were on our side or the other side, millions of people died. Largely because people got into positions of power and took over their nations and turned their nations into evil things and fought each other. Nothing much initially to do with ordinary working people, but ordinary people, of course, always get dragged into these conflicts started by the elites in nations who then start wars against each other, and then they conscript people into fighting the wars. And, you know, it would be better, of course, to avoid these things from happening in the first place. But history is history, and of course, we honour those who gave their lives and sacrificed their lives for freedom. Of course we do. But we also say, lest we forget. And we say lest we forget so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And everybody who speaks at every memorial service on Remembrance Sunday and other services always says we should not forget these things that happen so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past in our day. But we have forgotten. And there's two things that are happening right now in our decade that if we really hadn't forgotten, if we really took those words seriously, lest we forget, we wouldn't do them. The first, I think, is the conflict in Ukraine, which is now very much like the First World War. Two sides dug in behind trenches, firing at each other, killing each other. Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of young men have been killed in this conflict that's been going on this year, which could have been avoided so easily without the intransigence of the powers that be. And that's a tragedy. No, I have no sympathy for the National Socialists embedded in the Zelensky regime, of course. I've said that many times. But you have just ordinary young Ukrainians, ordinary young Russians being drawn up, conscripted, and they don't really have a choice in what they do, because, you know, the security services says, you're going to fight in the front line. And then, you know, what do? They can say no and they go to prison. Okay, they do have a choice. Everyone has a choice. But it's a choice with huge coercion. If you don't go up and fight in the front line, then something worse happens to you. You know, this is what's happened throughout history. The elites of the countries get into arguments with each other, start wars, and then the ordinary people who could build their countries, be doctors, engineers, builders, plumbers, whatever, get called up, and then they get slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands and millions on the front line. I've been saying from the very beginning of this conflict, just the West should not be escalating. We should de-escalate, and then it could be so easily over. But that time is gone now. You know, we've had a year of fighting, and when the ground hardens in Ukraine, it's going to be the right conditions for an escalation in fighting. You know, that's what's likely to happen later on in December. People are now talking about, it's the end of the conflict. It's not. It's the end of the first stage of the conflict. And unless there is some serious negotiations and some serious talks for peace, the second stage of the conflict will begin in December, and it'll be worse and more bloody than the first stage of the conflict. So when we say lest we forget, let's not forget, and let's try to end this situation and talk peace in Ukraine before hundreds of thousands of more lives are ended there. And the second thing we've forgotten is the tyranny of stirring up hatred. And of course, in National Socialist Germany, there was a lot of stirring up hatred against lots of different groups: Jews, Christians, Slavs, Gypsies, disabled people, were all victims of the National Socialist regime, declaring them as Untermenschen, and then stirring up hatred against them, and then justifying treating them like animals, and then putting them in concentration camps. And then under Mengele, of course, there were these dreadful experiments done on people without their consent. And this is just what's happened over the last 2 years. In most Western countries around the world, and other places too, that people have been coerced into having an injection of an experimental substance, as well as freedoms being taken away with what's called lockdowns. And before 2020, the only time anyone would use the word lockdown was in a maximum security prison, and it was a punishment for people who were making huge amounts of trouble in high max prisons, you know, threatening other people's lives, and you lock them down, you lock the prison down in order to stop people from killing each other because they're mentally deranged and violent and dangerous and so on. You never applied the word lockdown to ordinary people in a whole nation, but that's what happened in 2020 and onwards, and we had this idea that the governments had a right to lock people down in their homes in a whole country and treat a nation, turn a nation essentially into a giant prison. That happened in the UK, France, Spain, Canada, various states in the United States, Germany, Austria, Australia, New Zealand, all around the world. China, of course, all had these terrible lockdowns. We've forgotten. What do you think our forefathers who laid down their lives in the 1940s would think if they had heard that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren were going to be treated in such a way, and the freedoms that they fought for had been just evaporated into the air by this idea of lockdowns, as well as the total degeneration of our culture and all of the things that the same people are sending into our schools in order to try to damage our children, both mentally and physically. I think you know what I'm talking about there. As well as, of course, the experimental injections of substances that were known in animal trials to kill all of the animals they were tested on. So they stopped animal trials and went straight to human trials. And these things were given emergency use authorization without the proper testing procedures in place. Because if you want to bring a new medicine or pharmaceutical or vaccine to the market, normally it goes through at least 10 years of safety testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then you monitor things for health effects on an even longer ongoing basis over 10 or 20 years. But these things were all condensed into a single phase of trials, only taking about 3 months. And then they started injecting people with them. So there was absolutely no way that anybody could know the effects of these things in the medium or long term on a 5 to 10 year basis. And we still don't know the medium and long term effects of these things, and we won't know until 2025, 2030 or so on. But still, tens, hundreds of millions of people around the world, actually billions of people around the world, have been injected with substances. So when we say lest we forget, we need to call for a Nuremberg trial, because we shouldn't forget that those people in the Second World War who did these terrible experiments on human beings without their consent were sent to a Nuremberg trial, and they were held accountable, and they received the sentences that they received and which they deserved. So all the people who were being involved in the last 2 or 3 years in implementing lockdowns, in treating whole nations like prisoners when they were not prisoners and had done nothing wrong, and coerced people into taking an experimental injection without informed consent. All of those people, whether they're in government, whether they're in the media, whether they're in the behavioral psychology units that are trying to influence the governments and MPs, whether they're the police officers and constables who went around the country harassing people and abusing people for doing normal things like walking on a beach or talking to their friends in a park or going to church, or whether they're the nurses and doctors who knew that they shouldn't be injecting people with experimental substances, to the point where many of them didn't take it themselves or faked saline injections into famous people, politicians, and each other, but still went ahead and injected other people with these things. All of those people deserve a Nuremberg trial for what they've done. Lest we forget on Remembrance Sunday.